And do the pros of that hybrid slash partially remote approach outweigh the cons here?
Great. So I'll start by saying the big benefit of hybrid, the reason it's stuck, by the way, is it's profitable. I hate to be too much of a capitalist, but in some senses, if you like hybrid, capitalism is your savior right now because hybrid makes companies money. I mean, that's the bottom line. That's why more than 80% of S&P 500 companies have hybrid for professionals and managers. And the reason it makes companies money is
Welcome back to the Future of Work Weekly Report, the show where we break down the latest workplace trends, expose the nonsense, and give you the real insights. Because let's be honest, most corporate world is still trying to figure out how email works. Ha ha ha. We're working on some jokes like last week tonight. We'll get there. Anyway, today we're diving into the remote work divide, the cost savings hybrid work is bringing, even if some companies refuse to admit it, and why measuring actual outcomes is finally becoming a thing. And get this, your boss might actually stop caring about your screen time. It's a wild one, right? So let's go ahead and get into it. All right, let's start with the huge divide between people who work from home or remotely and those who don't in the office. According to a new study from the Center of Economic Policy Research, work from home or remote work employees are reporting higher productivity and job satisfaction, while in-office workers say they have better collaboration. Now, we're changing that at Grapevine, so check us out.
We've been discussing the Trump administration issuing buyout offers to millions of federal employees yesterday. You know, it came with a caveat, though. Those who don't resign will be called back to work in person 5 days a week. That's in line with an executive order issued by Trump on his first day in office, mandating fully in-person work for most federal employees. Now, the push away from remote work, it's just happening across the board, especially since the peak we saw during the pandemic. Just under 14% of Americans worked fully remote in 2023. As you see on your screens, that number's now down to about 18% in 2021. For more on this, let's bring in Julia Pollock. She's a chief economist at ZipRecruiter, joining us from LA. Thanks for getting up so early for us. Should we expect companies to follow suit after this federal mandate? Because this was such a big debate during and after the pandemic.
Well, return to office mandates certainly have a way of hogging headlines. But if you look at the numbers overall, remote work is about 5 times higher than it was before the pandemic and flat. It isn't going anywhere. We have seen some movement to the middle, to structured hybrid work, which is now sort of the dominant kind of mode of operation in most companies. But about 30% of companies are restricting remote work at the same time that about 30 are moving in the opposite direction and expanding it. This may change things in the DC area where there's a very high concentration of federal workers, with other companies feeling less pressure to offer remote flexibility now. But over much of the country, we expect remote work to stay fairly constant.
It's fascinating to hear that hybrid work remains popular and continues to spread. How are you seeing it being implemented, though? Because some employees report that there's a bit of a hierarchy where the more senior or more favored people are permitted a loose hybrid schedule, where those further down the hierarchy or less, senior are being told to be there 5 days a week. How is it playing out?
So in the big companies that have announced return to office mandates, what has frequently happened is that companies have revised those mandates within a couple of months once they've realized the cost. There's a huge recruitment and retention cost to forcing people back into the office 5 days a week. And what typically happens is that a company announces a policy at the top, and then they realize that that means losing some of their best and brightest. And when that happens, when people say, I can't do this, it doesn't work for my lifestyle, quickly managers figure out carve-outs for those favored employees, and they create exceptions. That can be corrosive to the culture in a company if it feels like there are different rules for different teams, different rules for different employees.
Translation: we trust you, but also not really. So come back into the office. The study confirms what we already knew. Remote workers feel more empowered, while in-office workers feel more connected. And hybrid workers, well, they're stuck in the middle, wondering if today is the day they have to pretend to enjoy forced office small talk. But the real takeaway: employees are productive at home, but companies are still dragging their feet on fully committing to it. Classic corporate indecision at its finest. Meanwhile, a new study from IWG, which, side note, runs co-working spaces, so of course they're going to hype up hybrid work, but they found that 79% of hybrid companies are saving money. And here's the thing, this actually makes sense. Less office space, lower utilities, and most importantly, fewer sad office birthday parties featuring those store-bought cupcakes that nobody really actually likes. I kind of like them. Anyway. But despite the clear financial benefits, some companies are still resisting hybrid work. Why? Because for some reason, they believe remote employees spend all day binge watching Netflix instead of working. That's just not true. There's other streaming apps out there, Max, Peacock, Apple Plus, Disney Plus, ESPN Plus, anything with a plus. But here's the reality check. Employees aren't slacking off. They're just not wasting hours in traffic or sitting at their desk for 8 hours a day trying to look busy instead of actually being productive.
So we know some of the benefits of hybrid work. Obviously, lower levels of stress, less commuting, better work-life balance. But some hybrid workers actually struggle with turning off work and the on and off work mode here. How has working from home actually affected work productivity? I know you kind of alluded to that in the beginning. And do the pros of that hybrid slash partially remote approach outweigh the cons here?
Great. So I'll start by saying the big benefit of hybrid, the reason it's stuck, by the way, is it's profitable. I hate to be too much of a capitalist, but in some senses, if you like hybrid, capitalism is your savior right now because hybrid makes companies money. I mean, that's the bottom line. That's why more than 80% of S&P 500 companies have hybrid for professionals and managers. And the reason it makes companies money is productivity is about flat. So it's not better, it's not worse. But the positives is quit rates are down around 20, 30% with hybrid, and quitting is really expensive for companies. Imagine you're a manager, somebody quits on you. They're like, you've got to go out, re-advertise, re-hire, re-recruit, retrain. It's very, very expensive. So, that's why hybrid's sticking here. In terms of, is it good or bad for employees? It's interesting. So we are surveying 10,000 Americans a month. We've been doing that for many months. 1 month earlier this year, we asked people, how many days a week is best for your mental health and your physical health? And it turns out it varies a lot, and it really looks like it aligns with what people want. So just to give you a sense, around 20% of people say they're happiest and their mental health is best that they come into the office every day. Think of them as maybe extroverts, or possibly they live on their own, or they don't have great home accommodation. They want to come in the happiest coming in every day. There's 30% that have the exact opposite. So they say, look, I really want to be at home every day. Maybe they like the closeness of family and friends. They're at home. Maybe they don't find workplace a pleasant environment. And then there's the remaining 50% that express various versions of hybrid. I think the bottom line is choice, and letting people choose is the critical thing. So in 2020, when we're all forced to be fully remote, there are a lot of people that are very unhappy, and that was quite damaging with mental health. But in 2019, we're all forced to be fully in person. That was also not great for some people. Now, 2024, I feel like it's the best of both worlds if we give employees choice. Now, that may not be choice in your own employer. As I mentioned earlier, it's kind of difficult to do something that's different from your colleagues. So choice, I think, in the long run may actually mean that different firms offer different practice. Amazon is claiming it's going to get people back 5 days a week. Other tech firms are letting you, like GitHub, work fully remote. If you're in tech, it means moving around so that what keeps you happiest is what your employer is offering.
Now, MIT just dropped an article that might be the most common sense thing I've read in years. It argues that companies should stop obsessing over hours worked and start measuring actual results. Like how literally everything else in life works. But here's the catch. Measuring outcomes is hard. It requires clear expectations, good leadership, and most importantly, trust. The problem is some leaders still think working hard means looking busy, which is why so many employees are stuck in a cycle of pointless meetings and productivity theater, because that's what it is, theater.
And if you hadn't spent a lot of time doing things like helping train managers to manage outcomes, building team level agreements, then all of a sudden you found yourself in this hybrid world with managers who weren't really sure how to manage and lead people when the economy was getting more challenging. And so we tend to, that's what's causing, I think, some of this rubber band snapback from senior executives who have what Taryn Brim on my team calls leadership nostalgia. We need to go back to the way that things worked in the past, because back then we knew how to manage all this. But again, you're trying to unscramble an egg. And what you're really doing is saying, I'm just going to go back to a weaker form of management in the first place, which is let's just monitor people and make sure they're in the space.
I love that term that you use, the managing to outcomes or managing by outcome. Let's dig a little bit deeper into that. Like, what does that mean in practice? And specifically, I'm really curious to understand, for a manager, how do their daily or weekly routines or rituals actually have to shift to enable managing by outcome?
So it takes a lot of work, and it actually starts at the top. It's got to start at the top. What you can do within your team as well, but it's really about the clear articulation of a limited set of goals for the organization that you can put some degree of measurement against that set of goals over a span of time, right? So objectives and key results is the methodology that Google made most famous. Salesforce has a process they call the V2MOM: vision, values, methods, obstacles, and metrics, which is largely the same thing. But what you're doing is saying, these are the most important things for us as an organization: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And here are the ways in which we're going to measure our progress against those 5 things over the coming year. And then you're spending time cycling back and seeing how you're doing. If by doing that, you're also then giving teams tools that they can use to say, okay, my team aligns to number 3, and here's how we're going to manage and lead to that. Those end up being really essential, because you've got to have that clear articulation of goals and objectives and ways in which you're measuring it to then measure out whether you're hitting the outcomes that you're looking for in the first place. And you can take that down several layers in the organization. You can do this in other ways that are reasonably simple. When I was a startup CEO, we had what we called the blue sheet. This is back when people printed stuff off on pieces of paper. It was a list of 10 items, not more than 10, that we would review as a management team on a monthly basis, and then we got it to quarterly. They're the most important projects in the team: the DRI, the directly responsible individual, the team who was on it, and the goal we were aiming for. And the benefit of that was, besides having a clear articulation of objectives that we could measure ourselves against, it was also really much easier when people ran into conflict, meaning we both need Mike's time. Well, project number 2 needs Mike's time, and project number 8 needs Mike's time. Guess what? Mike needs to work on number 2 before he works on number 8. Doing that, articulating the priorities and getting there takes work. It means the management team has to sort of lean into this in order to be able to do it. But in doing that, you're also then training the people who are one layer below you to understand the process and how you do it, so they can then take it and do the same thing with their teams. So part of this is it's process, but it's also training.
And finally, Forbes published an article arguing that success should be measured by what you achieve, not how long you sit at a desk. Radical. I know. It's a revolution. This shift is critical, especially for remote teams where managers can't just hover over your desk to make sure you look busy. Micromanagement, I control you, that kind of stuff. The good news, more companies are starting to embrace this mindset. The bad news, some will cling to outdated office policies until the bitter end. Amazon, JP Morgan Chase, Dell, the federal government now. The list kind of goes on.
Well, this had all of us talking. A new study looking at the pros and cons of remote work.
Economists at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York say young workers may be missing the power of proximity, like this. A recent New York Times article looked at the research saying that remote work enhanced the productivity of engineers when they were studying, but reduced the amount of feedback that some junior engineers were receiving.
So joining us now is Ben Castleman. He co-wrote the article and is an economics reporter for the New York Times. Ben, good to have you with us. Lilia and I, obviously you can tell, love being together. And one of the interesting things about your study, or about the study rather, is the power of proximity. Talk to us about what researchers say is that power.
Yeah, so this is some research that was based on a big tech company where they were actually able to measure the feedback that engineers received and gave to one another. And they found that when teams were split up across campuses, or when, of course, we all went remote in the pandemic, that workers, and especially young workers, just got less feedback from their senior colleagues and from their bosses. And, I think this sort of captures something that maybe some of us know intuitively, but it's been tough to measure, right? Which is that a lot of career development, and especially early career development, comes through these sort of informal channels, right? It's seeing your colleagues working, it's asking them questions, it's them giving you advice, it's your boss giving you sort of little tips, and that can be really hard to replicate in a remote environment.
Yeah, I can imagine that, because one thing is, getting an official email, that's like a serious thing of something you did wrong. But if you run into someone and they can tell you, hey, I would have done it this way, it seems like a big gap. So does it start to feel now like companies are thinking that remote work was a mistake?
I mean, look, on some level, I think the genie is out of the bottle there, right? We know we're not all going back to the way things were before. And so I think what studies like this are important for is they start to figure out, what has actually been lost so that we can then start to figure out ways of actually adjusting that capture that. Some of these things that just happened organically, maybe now companies need to figure out ways to do more intentionally. We've learned how to give formal reviews or do hiring, some of these sort of formal processes online. Now we got to figure out ways to do some of the more informal processes because it's not happening in the way that it did in the past.
That's an interesting point, Ben. And obviously, these are preliminary findings, but there were also advantages that came out of working remotely, particularly for women, for parents, for people who are non-traditional workers. When do you think we'll actually suss out the true impact of remote work, and what will last for us?
Yeah, and I think this is part of what makes this issue so tricky, right? Is it's not remote work good or remote work bad, right? We hear from workers that they like it, that they value it. It obviously is very beneficial for, parents with young children, for people who have caregiving responsibilities, but also we often find that senior folks are more productive when they're working from home. So we have those real advantages, but there are also these disadvantages that may be slower to emerge, right? Those early career impacts you may not pick up on right away, and it may be years down the line before they become fully clear. And so, I think what we're seeing now is that they're both sides of the coin, and companies are going to have to grapple with sort of how to design the workplace of the future in a way that it, saves the good parts of work from home and the good parts of the office.
All right, Ben Castleman, thank you.
Thanks so much.
But let's recap as we close this Future of Work Weekly Report out. Work from home or remote work versus office divide is very much real. It's a real conversation. Hybrid work saves companies money, but some are still in denial. And measuring results instead of hours is obviously the way forward, even though some are still clinging to that outdated way of thinking. We're seeing progress towards the future. And if your boss still cares more about your screen time than your results, it might be time to update that resume. I didn't say that. That's it for this week's Future of Work Weekly Report. Make sure to like, subscribe, and send this to your work Slack channel or in Grapevine with the message, "See, I told you, this meeting could have been an email." All right, thanks so much for watching, and we will see you next week.